Yeah, a hush falls over the crowd.
Well, welcome everybody to this Sunday's session. Today we're going to be talking about grief and, full disclosure, grief in general and grief that is complicated and hard. And I'm so grateful to introduce to you our speaker, Christy Schunn. I've been blessed to know Christy since my Bethel College days. So I have seen Christy as a student and a community leader and as somebody people love to work with. And as Christy shares with us, you will understand why. Christy comes to us from the Kansas Infant, Death, and SIDS Network, which is a statewide network, and I'm going to be handing out some literature that you can take if you want, or you can pass it along, but I'll get started with that in a moment. I called on Christy because she also teaches at Bethel, a few classes every semester in the fall, and someone else I admire a lot gave me Christy as her first recommendation for somebody to share with us on grief. I'm really grateful to Christy for coming today. Thanks.
Well, you know who I am. I live in North Newton, and I'm a social worker. I did have the fortunate opportunity to be at Bethel College when Bev was there and got my social work degree there, and then went to the University of Kansas and got my master's. And like she said, I've been doing grief and loss work for a long time. I had the opportunity to also work with Bev's sister at the Kids Network, Libby Baumgartner, and I think Nadine Reimer-Penner is the person maybe that recommended me, and many of you may know Nadine. She was my first boss out of graduate school when I worked for hospice. So grief and loss has been my thing over the last 25 years, which sometimes feels like 50 and sometimes thinks, how can I be that age? So I'm imagining many of you have also been in that space. So there's some materials. One of the things that I learned in school was make sure you give people something to hold on to. But if you don't want paper and you're more electronic, just pass it on by. I don't know if you're like me. Sometimes I get home and I think, I was listening to that person, I had that thought, I don't know how to reconnect. And so you can take one or the other or both or none. So totally up to you. I just thought if I don't have something, somebody's going to say, it would be helpful to have this. So like Beverly said, we're going to talk a little bit about, she asked me to talk about traumatic death, or what the world of bereavement will call complicated loss. But it's hard to talk about complicated loss if you don't talk about uncomplicated loss. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm also going to dive into some of the things that we can do to companion people, and some of the things that we have found that people need or want when they're grieving. And I want you to also just keep in mind as I'm talking that loss, for sure we think about death, but we also need to think about job loss, tornadoes, hurricanes, global violence that's happening all around us. All of that is triggering the losses that we've had inside of us. And so I want to keep in mind that we have lots of losses that we're dealing with. So with that, I'm going to use some of the different coping strategies that I've learned over the years of working in grief and loss. And so the first is what we call bibliotherapy, or books. So this is a book that I love. It's a simple explanation. It's actually Lifetime's A Beautiful Way to Explain Death to Children. But when we're grieving, sometimes it's hard to conceptualize the deep inner workings of grief. And so I find that children's books I use for all ages because it's simple explanation. So we'll start here. There is a beginning and an ending for everything that is alive. In between is living. All around us, everywhere, beginnings and endings are going on all the time, with living in between. This is true for all living things, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, for even the tiniest of insects. Nothing that is alive goes on living forever. How long it lives depends upon what it is and what happens while it is living. Sometimes living things become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again. But there are times when they are so badly hurt or they are so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. This can happen when they are young or old or anywhere in between. And this is a picture of a butterfly. It may be sad, but it is the way of all things, and it is true for everything that is alive, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, even for the tiniest of insects. There are lots of living things in our world. Each one has its own special lifetime. Trees that are tall and strong grow slowly, standing in the sunshine and in the rain. Some of them live for a very long time indeed, as long as 100 years or more. That is their lifetime. Rabbits and mice, they grow up in only a few weeks. They go on to live for a year or two, crunching up carrots and nibbling at cheese until they grow old and very tired, and it is their time to die. This is how it happens to be for rabbits and mice. It is the way they live, and it is their lifetime. Flowers and vegetables, planted as seeds at the beginning of spring when the earth is warm, grow quickly to live through the heat of summer. The days pass and they become old during autumn when it is cooler. Then when winter comes and it is cold, they die. It is the way they live, and it is their lifetime. Butterflies live as butterflies for only a few weeks. Once they have dried their wings, they flutter and flit from leaf to flower. At first they are bright and quick, but as time passes, they begin to slow down until finally they can go no further. They rest for a while and then they die. This is the way butterflies live, and this is their lifetime. Birds grow up quite differently and quickly too. It is often no more than a few months from the time that they hatch until they are strong enough to fly and feed themselves. How long they live after that seems to depend upon their size. Mostly the bigger they are, the longer they will live. That is the way birds live. Some for as long as 50 years, others for no more than 2 or 3. But however long, it is their lifetime for each one. Fish, swimming in lakes and rivers or in the sea, can be so tiny it's hard to tell that they are there at all, or so big that the only way to describe them is enormous. Again, as far as we know, it seems that the smaller they are, the shorter will be their lifetime. But that is how it is for fish. Their lives can be as little as a day or so, or as long as 80 or 90 years. It is the way they live, and those are their lifetimes. And people? Well, like everything else that is alive, people have lifetimes too. They live for about 60 or 70 years, sometimes even longer, doing all the things that people do, like growing up and being grown up. It can happen, though, just as it does with other living things, that people become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again. But there are times when they're so badly hurt or they are so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. It may be sad, but that is how it is for people. It is the way they live, and it is their lifetime. So no matter how long they are or how short, lifetimes are really all the same. They have beginnings, they have endings, and there is living in between. That is how things are for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for animals, and even the tiniest creatures, everywhere. So what is the nature of grief? What is this thing that we go through when these lifetimes come to an end? What I want people to know, and what the world of Thantology would want people to know, is that grief is a normal, natural response to loss. It is just what we do. Grief operates on its own internal wisdom. Grief is human, and it's also highly individual. Grief is the only way that we heal. So Therese Rando is somebody who experienced sudden, unexpected traumatic grief at a very early age, and then she went on to have a lifetime working on research and writing about grief and loss. And so some of the things that I'm going to share with you are things that people have learned, and we've learned a lot over the years, and we just keep learning and adding to this information. So what is healthy grieving? Past grief sets up expectations for future losses. This is why I think it's important to do grief work, because every time we experience a loss, it connects with other losses. So if you had a hamster as a child and that hamster died and your family did a burial, or somebody made fun of you, or there was shaming involved, you pack that away, and the next time you have a loss, it triggers that early loss. So loss is cumulative, and it interconnects with each loss. So grieving well, or grieving in healthy ways, I really encourage from tiny little kids up, because we will experience losses in our life, and those early exposures to bereavement and mourning is what we will carry with us. So past experiences. Back and forth with glasses. Welcome to the mid-50s. So you want to identify the coping strategies and then defense mechanisms. And I'm going to try not to get too theoretical here, but we have all these defense mechanisms, but we also have coping mechanisms like journaling or planting a tree or putting a bench in a park. So that's what I mean by a strategy versus defense mechanism like denial. I'm going to block this. Subsequent grief can be slightly easier to cope with, like I said, if there's been good grieving that's gone on. So definitions: what is grief? What is mourning? What is bereavement? So grief is that emotional response when you experience a loss. Mourning is more like the rituals. So being in a church setting is perfect. Do you take meals? That's mourning. How do you serve people? How do you care for people when they've had a loss? Sitting down with folks and just listening to them. So mourning is sort of the activity. It refers to the rituals that are defined by your family or your church or your community. And bereavement is the objective situation of, it's the noun, if you will. We are bereaved people when someone has been lost. So you can't really talk about grief and loss without talking about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. I actually am a big fan. She's somebody that studied and traveled all over. Her final days were in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Phoenix, Arizona is my hometown, so I feel like I have a bit of a kindred spirit. Never met her, never saw her present, but certainly sort of hung on her every word. She's gotten a lot of flack because she has these stages, but she was a trailblazer. She talked about grief and loss and death at a time where it was so taboo. You just didn't talk about it out loud, and people whispered, someone died, or this one we would say, cancer. So saying the words, she was one of the very first persons that researched it and said it. So she came up with what she found were these stages. So you've all heard about them: denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And then somebody decided, we're just going to have to go through each one of these, click, 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 click. And if you don't do it this way, you're doing it wrong. I don't think that's what she meant. I also like to draw attention to the fact that she was interviewing people who had terminal illnesses. She was not interviewing bereaved people. So the person that she was talking to that was going through these stages, they were dying, they were terminally ill. And we've sort of taken the information and said, if your mom died, you're going to go through these stages. That wasn't even the research that she did. So we've sort of made up our own story for it. But I think we still need to go back to, and we know that denial and isolation and bargaining and anger can all be a part of dying and of grieving. So the newer researchers, the people who have read Kubler-Ross and moved into other realms, they think about stages of grief more as phases. So think about it like the phase of a moon. And as I've worked with bereaved families for the last 20, 25 years, they go through experiences, and I'm imagining you can all identify with this as well. There's a pretty acute phase of grief. The folks that I'm working with, they've all had a baby die suddenly and unexpectedly. There's a lot of acute, traumatic, complicated loss that's associated. And somehow, things shift. But then all of a sudden, when their child should be going to kindergarten, it's all right back on them. And so we talk about this more as phasing. So there's good days and there's bad days. There's good hours and there's bad hours. And that's just the way that we grieve. So instead of linear stages, we're going to think about phases. What are some of the initial responses that people have? Shock and numbness, disbelief or denial. I'm a big supporter of denial because it's one of the ways that we protect our brain. When I've met a new family that's just had a baby die and they're denying what's happened, it's because they're trying to figure out how to keep breathing. They're trying to figure out how to keep themselves alive. They're trying to figure out how to eat another bite of food. They're trying to figure out how to lay down at night. And sometimes they just have to have that brain break. So denial gets a bad rap. I'm a big supporter of it. People feel disorganized, despair, depression, isolation, sometimes yearning and searching. I particularly see a lot of yearning and searching. The internet has made that complicated because people can find almost anything in the middle of the night when they can't sleep, and they can hang on that. So the yearning and searching is a really big piece of, I think, complicated losses and traumatic losses. Awareness of the death, that's where you start seeing some of the anger and some of the guilt. And then my hope is that people reorganize their thoughts, their life, the way that they approach things. I don't know if they ever fully accept the loss for what it is, but they do change the way they live and how they think about the loss. And for some people, you could use the word acceptance if you wanted. They're never okay with it. I've never met a parent that's okay with the fact that their child died suddenly and unexpectedly, but somehow they incorporate that child and that loss into the life that they live. So uncomplicated grief. It is feelings in our head, physical sensations, cognitions, the way we think about things. This is where I need glasses again. And our behaviors. So what do we do? How do we act? How do we feel? How do we think? That's what's normal. That's what people do when they have experienced a loss, and it's uncomplicated. I'll just be real honest. One of my losses is eyesight. About 10 years ago, I started having retinal detachments, and so I don't read out of my left eye, so distance is hard and close up is hard. So I have all different glasses and contacts and things and lots of surgeries that have tried to make it better, but I'm gonna look at both screens and try to look at my notes as well. I've had to change the way I live my life. I have to have lots of different glasses. I have to have lots of different light in different ways. So that's where it's a loss, it's not a death. But it had a certain sense of grief. I stopped driving for a while. And so you guys can probably relate to some of those things as we've aged or just things that have happened. There are complicated losses and there is complicated grief. Not every complicated loss results in complicated grief. Okay, so some folks can have a traumatic loss and they can have uncomplicated grief. And so this is the normal, what our bodies go through, what our brains go through when we experience a loss. We have the feelings, we have the physical sensations of sometimes tingling or some numbness, the cognition, the preoccupation, that yearning, that searching for why this happened. And that last box, I just cannot read well enough. Yeah, sorry, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. So I'm just gonna have to look close. Change in appetite. So a lot of times when I first talk to folks, they'll be like, I just can't eat anything. And so one of the things I say when I first call folks is, has anyone gotten you any food? And they're like, well, you know, I had some pop and some potato chips. So I then talk to the supporting people and say, can you get some protein? And you don't have to eat a whole meal. You don't have to have a steak. You don't have to have an entire sandwich. Bites. But that's one of the things that people just often, they just don't have any appetite anymore. And so we do try to let them know what is normal grief and what are some of the sensations that they will go through. It's also psychoeducation. I think it's a place that mental health has gone to. I'm really happy to see you have a flashlight.
I do. I know what it's like to lose what you can't see.
Yes.
So it's like, Dave, we got to get a light. Here, take it.
Oh, you're just gonna let me hold it. Okay, thank you.
Just hold it
Okay.
with yourself to help you.
Thank you. I hope I don't wear your battery out.
If you do, then we'll charge it.
We'll plug it in. Good solution. Speaking of absent-minded, my own loss makes me feel a little absent-minded. I sometimes just can't quite figure out where I'm going. Do you ever, you're in one room and you go to the other room and you stand there and think, what did I come in here for? And hopefully you go back to the other room and you remember and then you're back there. Grief is like that. Grief is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job that is taxing your brain, whether you're awake or you're asleep or you're in between. And that's wearing. That stress is very wearing. Restlessness, overactivity, crying, sighing. That was one of the things I didn't realize until I started working at hospice. You'll just have people that you're working with and I was teaching one of the classes at Bethel, and one of the girls, I was saying this, and one of the students came up afterwards and said, you know, my grandmother just died in the last couple of months. And when you said sighing, all of a sudden I realized I sigh all the time now. So who knew? So if you find yourself sighing, a lot of times we sigh because we're exasperated. But sometimes we're sighing because we're just trying to make sense of things in our head. And so that's sort of an outward expression. And sometimes we need to avoid the grief. And that's okay too. So that's what uncomplicated grief looks like. So just to restate it in a different way. Bodily distress, preoccupation with the image of the deceased. So a lot of our families, you'll see them put pictures everywhere. Guilt related to the deceased or circumstances of the death. I've never met a family that's had a baby die suddenly and unexpectedly that in some way didn't blame themselves. And that's one of the hardest things to get over because we think in this world, not we in this room, that parents are omnipotent. You're supposed to be everywhere, all-knowing, and be able to intercede in any kind of a tragic event. So I work really hard with families also to say, you may have been able to do things differently which would have made the outcome different, but you were not intentionally trying to harm this child. This was a bad thing that happened. And so they are trying to grapple with that grief and also that guilt. Some folks will have hostile reactions, and that's sometimes when I hear from law enforcement when I first get a referral. I just need to tell you about what the dad did when I walked into the house. That's normal to me. They're very, very angry, and all of us have different ways that we show that anger. And an inability to function the way we did before the loss. Not an inability to function, just the way we did previously. So what are the tasks? What are we trying to do as we're trying to work through this? At some point, the goal, according to J. William Worden, who I also kind of see as a mentor, I actually have had the opportunity to hear him speak a number of times. He wrote this book called Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, and there are 4 tasks we're trying to help people move through. Accept the reality of the loss, just the reality. To work through the pain, rather than shutting the door and moving on down the road and saying everything's fine and rosy, you gotta work through and dig through that pain and those difficult memories. Then adjust to an environment where that person is not here. And then emotionally relocate the deceased and move to a different space in life. So finding a place to place their child in their body, in their mind, in their house, the shrine of pictures, the candle, the garden, the placard on the back of their car, whatever it is, what we're helping them do is relocate a place for that child or that person. We are very resilient people, but we aren't naturally resilient. We didn't just come out of the womb resilient. Resilience was taught. I'm a big supporter of understanding what resilience is, because a lot of people say, oh, this child had so-and-so die, they're resilient, they'll bounce back. They don't just bounce back because they're human. They bounce back, or they're resilient, because of about 5 or 6 things. And there's a social worker, her name's Nan Henderson, and she identified this wheel. And in order for us to be resilient as people, we have to have care and support. We have to have people in our court. And so when I'm talking to a new family that's had a baby die, or anyone that's had anyone die, do you have people who really love you, who are there for you, who can listen, who have your back? So you have a mom, you have a sister, but it's always about their grief. I need you to help me identify somebody who's really got your back. Nan Henderson would say, you've got to have care and you've got to have support. There has to be bonding. So not only do I have that care and support, but I have to have this connection and attachment. I also need to have a meaningful participation in that relationship. So you think about children that grow up in families where maybe they're on one side of the room and they're on their phones and there's no connection. So they have to have meaningful participation in that family. So I always visualize family dinner where mom and dad, or mom or caregivers or whoever is in there, and the kids, and people are asking the children, how was your day? What do you think about this meal? What do you guys want to do? That's meaningful participation. So asking people what they really think. Good boundaries. So to have a resilient person, you have to have solid boundaries. You also have to have open communication. And there needs to be the teaching of life skills. So as in mourning, how are we going to grieve together? So complicated. Complicated grief, or what they call prolonged grief. And if you really want to kind of get nerdy and learn about this, just put those 2 words in a search engine, and you're going to hear all the scuttle between all the researchers that are trying to figure this out. Traumatic loss. And it's good scuttle, it's good argument, because I think they're making it better and they're making the care and treatment better for people. But there's a lot of question about, should we call this complicated grief? Should we call this prolonged grief? And then how should we treat it? It is sometimes this complicated grief can be because of unanticipated grief, so that's sudden, unexpected, or chronic grief. It just goes on. You think about folks that maybe were in service somewhere, and we don't, they're missing in action. We don't know, are they dead? Are they alive? That's the prolonged grief. Delayed grief. I had a friend that was pregnant with a child, and the baby was born like a day before, a day after her mom died. She was attending to her child's birth, and so her grief was delayed because she really didn't have space in her head to work on her mom's death until she could have this baby and get on her feet. So that was a little bit delayed. Exaggerated grief. It's where the grief is really extreme. And I think sometimes the exaggerated grief might be related to those previous losses that were uncared for. And so it's just a very extreme reaction. Sobbing can be very normal, but not for months and months and months. And then repressed grief. So again, that stuff that we shoved in the closet, closed the door, and just went on. So sometimes delayed grief and repressed grief can work together, right? I had to delay this to work on these other things. It got repressed. I never went back to it. And so there it is. That can be complicated, or what causes prolonged grief. So what actually is it? Intense grief is typical after we lose someone close. Grief remains intense until we adapt to the loss. For an estimated 10 to 15% of bereaved people, adapting becomes problematic. Complicated grief rates are higher when the death is sudden, unexpected, or violent, or when a very young person dies. This means that many people in the world suffer from complicated grief for a long time, especially in a disaster or conflict affected areas. So I have just been thinking, as many of you have, a lot about Gaza and the years of grief and violence and loss that's been happening, and how that has just become part of their DNA at this point. So talk about complicated grief when you're looking at some of the stuff that's happening over there. And you can even see some of it on TV that then triggers our own grief. So some of the risk factors for complicated grief include that prior history of a mood or anxiety disorder. So we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health. I'm glad to see that in this day and age, we're equating the two a little bit more, that you need to care for your physical health and your mental health. It is a natural response to the things that we experience and witness in the world. So if you were to go through complicated grief therapy, and this is a woman that I also had the opportunity to meet. Her name is Catherine Shear. She's a psychiatrist. She happens to work at the School of Social Welfare, Social Work in New York. So it's been interesting to me. She's created this Center for Complicated Grief. And her focus is to help people adapt to the loss in two ways. And so again, I'm talking about complicated grief, not just a complicated loss. We have to identify and resolve the grief complications. What's causing the hiccup? Where are we tripping up? What is it that's causing it to be prolonged? And then facilitate natural adaptive processes. And the way that she works on this is, like I said earlier, sort of psychoeducation. Let's understand what grief is. Let's manage the painful emotions. So when we shut down, when we're in denial, when we can't get out of bed, when we close the curtains, when we shut ourselves off from people, how are we going to manage that? What are we going to do? Are we going to do grounding techniques? I feel the ground beneath me. I see the people around me. I hear the birds. I feel the sun. So we're going to manage those painful emotions. We're also going to think about the future. So we're not just stuck in this moment. What are some of the things beyond right now that we're going to try to focus on? Strengthen relationships. I think that might be easier said than done. I've been to some funerals in my life where there's been 400 plus people. And I've also been to funerals where there's 3 people. And my coworker and I are the other 2. Finding support people for some folks is not as easy as it might be for you and me. And so strengthening relationships can be a really hard road. Getting to a point where they can tell the story of the death. And this is where grief work with traumatic losses may be different than other traumas in life. There are some traumas that you don't just sit down with somebody and have them tell you everything that happened. But the goal with a traumatic loss, a traumatic death, is to have them at some point be able to recount. And so some of the things that we do in our support meetings on a monthly basis is tell us a little bit about the day before Sam died. Tell us a little bit about the day that Sam died. And then I have different parents that are able to say it in different ways. So we want to get them to a point where they feel comfortable in an environment to say what happened, realizing that there's a lot of guilt sometimes. I should have done something different. And so that's where I chime in and say, this was not intentional. This was a terrible thing that happened to you. And we are going to learn and grow together. And so that's what we're doing in support meetings. Then also learning to live with the reminders, so the things that trigger you. We just had a support meeting about a week and a half ago, and interestingly enough, Halloween is a big thing for new parents because there's so many cute little outfits, and they were going to buy this little sweet pea outfit, and unfortunately, in the case a couple of weeks ago, the baby died on September 24th or 25th, and I said, pull that outfit out, hold it, cry on it, sob on it, do whatever you need to do. Putting it in the drawer and pretending you're not sad about it isn't going to be helpful. So bring it into your existence. And it was so interesting that about a week, or like right at Halloween, I saw this particular parent post about her child and the little outfit that she had so been looking forward to putting on her baby. So as trick-or-treater, I mean, something as simple as trick-or-treaters coming to the door might be the thing that triggers. So maybe a parent that's had a child die in a car accident. when their child should have been graduating. The president of our board said one time, he came to a board meeting and he had just given a futon to a friend whose child was going to college. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know why I keep crying. And he goes, I guess it's because I bought that futon when my child was a baby, thinking it would go to college with him. And so now just giving that simple futon to a friend whose child survived and went to college is the thing that threw him back. And I honestly, this man didn't cry. He was the stoic dad who was always supporting mom. And he just was, he's like, I can get myself together. We have a board meeting in a few minutes. I was like, that's fine. This is why we're here. This is why we do what we do. So something as simple as a futon or a little outfit or a Christmas ornament or the smell of something that our olfactory triggers when I walk into certain houses, or the way my grandmother used to cook, or the way my husband does this. We also sometimes have little hallucinations via sound or visual, where we see somebody on an escalator that looked just like Grandpa, and all of a sudden we turn around and we're following them. Because in our brain, that person, that image is etched in there. And so that person looked like them, and then all of a sudden you get up there and you're like, oh, nope, this is not who this is. So we want to learn to live with those reminders. And then we also want to remember and memorialize the person who has died. Some therapists might also engage in what they call EMDR for folks that have really experienced lots of trauma, homicide, suicide, the mass shootings that are going on so frequently I can hardly keep track of them, the things that are happening in Gaza. So EMDR is a treatment where it's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I don't do it. I have had it done with me before. I think it's sort of magic. I don't understand all of it. I've not really become an expert in it. But for whatever reason, a therapist can set up an environment with a client that's very safe and protected. And they do this thing tapping bilaterally, either on the shoulders or the hands, or the person can move things from hand to hand if they don't appreciate touch. And so this EMDR is a way that they can process. And so in complicated grief, these are some of the things that they're working on. I want to check time. Okay. So I'm not going to geek out too much on this, and I'm going to put this down because I think at this point I'm just going to talk with my hands. So dual process model. So this is where bereaved individuals alternate between the loss and coping or restoration. So think of an oscillating fan. People go in and out of the intense grief. So the loss-oriented coping, so when you're in that sorrow, that loss-oriented coping involves dealing with many of the intense emotions that occur after the death. Restoration, the other side, is referring to the ways in which bereaved individuals attempt to reconstruct or re-engage their lives. This can be laughing. This can be going for a walk in the sunshine. This can be acknowledging the wind in your face or the coolness of the breeze. Then there's the sorrow. This feels like despair. This feels like intense crying. This feels like lots of anger. And then oscillating over here where you feel joy again. They call it the dual process model. And so you move into the joy, into the sorrow. You need this brain break because you can't do this every day, all day, for months on end. So again, just talking about this support group meeting that we had last week, I had a sense that this mom who was newly bereaved was spending a lot of time over here and feeling guilty when she came over here. Because I said, sometimes people feel guilty when they laugh for the first time because their child died and there should be nothing happy ever again in their lives, is what they think. My child died, my spouse died, my whatever. I must live this road of intense pain because my child's no longer here. And so when I said, we want you to spend some time in restorative health. So the next time you see somebody who's really grieving hard, and then all of a sudden they're sort of laughing uncontrollably, That's their brain doing the work that it needs to do so they can take a break and then move back to the hard grief. You've also heard people say on TV all the time, if you watch the news, if you watched the stuff about Gaza every day, all day, you know what it feels like at the end of the day where you're like, I need to shut the TV off. I can't watch this every day, all day. I have to go do something else. And so you'll hear psychologists and social workers and say all the time, you want kids and people to be cognizant of what's going on in the world, but not every day, all day. You have to take those brain breaks. So turn the news off, go for a walk. And so that will lead us into coping and meaning making. So another person that I really think is cool, his name is Robert Niemeyer. He is a psychologist. He, amongst a number of other people, have developed what they call meaning making. And that is that people construct meaning about themselves and the world through their relationships and their stories. The distress that's caused by the loss of the significant other leads bereaved individuals to begin to process for searching of meaning over the loss. So one of the scenarios that I talk about, we have a board member who shared her story on TV, so I'm not breaching confidentiality here, but Patty, her little girl Juanita, died about 21 years ago. One of the very first families that I really got to know deeply. And I said to Patty one day, how is it that you and Mauricio have grieved in the way that you have in such a healthy, amazing way? And she said, well, one day we decided, we were sitting with each other, and we said, we can be sad for the rest of our lives, and there will be moments where we are, or we can choose to live the life that Juanita would want us to live. And we will do things in memory and in honor. So you see these things every day. What she does is comes and helps with a Spanish-speaking baby shower. She and Mauricio grew up in South America. She came over as an exchange student, went back home, got married, came back over here, and they've lived here for the last 20, 25 years. Unfortunately, very soon after they had their second child, Juanita died at about 3 months. But she said, I don't think Juanita would want us to stay stuck in this grief. But she had resilience because she had a group of people who supported her. And she came to support groups, and she did that hard work. And so that's meaning making. You see 5K walks, you see candles, you see memorials, they're everywhere. Somebody has died, somebody has decided to plant this garden in memory of this person. That's the meaning making. That's making sense of this loss and somehow transforming into a space where I will honor and have a legacy for this person rather than sitting here in the despair in that acute early phase. So Robert Niemeyer works also on poetry. So here is a poem that he wrote as he is doing grief and loss work with his clients. Again, extreme, traumatic loss. The art of longing. Those of us who have driven the long, cold road alone have watched the thin line of trees, frosted white, slipping behind like memories. We know the pull of something unseen, beyond the reach of dry eyes, fixed, blinking at the distant mist. We ride the road with our lonely ghosts, unwavering in their devotion, like penitents at the altar of our grief. This is how we perfect the art of longing. Learn to nurse the hurt, refuse the fullness of this world. For now we keep driving, lean into the dimming light, lean further toward winter's receding horizon and away from arrival. We can stay stuck. We can stay in that despair. We can name it like this person did in their grief and in their poetry, and also oscillate to this place of joy and restoration. So what I just talked right through that slide. Nope, I went backwards, sorry. Which button? So what do bereaved want? Just in a nutshell, what I've learned from the people that I've worked with at hospice and foster care, and then the last 20 years at the Kids Network, people would like to be able to tell their story. They want to be heard, not just, oh, I remember when my so-and-so died, I felt the same way. Really be heard, really be able to tell their story. They want to live and visit with others who have survived losses, so support groups.